Welcome to Theories and Problems in Visual Art. This is lecture 5 in the history series on the idea that art oscillates. This is actually the second of 3 lectures on ways of dividing up history. Last time I was talking about periods and periodization of art. This time the theme is the idea that art is like a pendulum, that it swings back and forth between styles, and that's the way it proceeds through history. I'm going to talk mostly about 2 art historians, a Swiss art historian, Heinrich Wölfflin, and a German, Erwin Panofsky, and then I have some slides on the problems with this idea of oscillating history. So Wölfflin, the O with the umlaut, by the way, is pronounced more or less like it was an R. He's a practitioner of what's now called style analysis, which is a way of identifying artworks by their historical style, like Renaissance, Baroque, Neoclassical, and so on. He's been very widely criticized, for example, by Gombrich, whose name will come up through all of these history lectures, because he said very little about the social and political context of the artworks that he studied, and even less about the artists themselves. He wasn't interested in biography, or politics, or reception, or any of the things that historians are interested in these days. He was mainly interested in what the works looked like. But despite that limitation, this book of his, published in 1914, is still taught to students of art history, mostly because he's such a persuasive writer, and his examples are so well described, very good examples of what they call in literature close looking. So when he was thinking about the way that art oscillates, the words that he mostly used were classical and Baroque. And those are not necessarily period terms. In other words, when he says classical, he's not necessarily talking about classical Greece or any other classical period. And when he says Baroque, he doesn't necessarily mean 17th century European art. They're his own terms, and they mean art that has certain qualities, which is exemplified by what he thinks of as classical and Baroque art. Each of those 2 has a number of properties. So as you can see on the left, 5 formal properties, and there are others too, which Wölfflin assigned to art that's classical and art that's Baroque. So art that was classical, he said, and I'm looking at the left-hand bullet point list there, art that was classical was linear, it was planar, it was closed, and so on. Art that was Baroque was painterly and recessional. So I'll give some examples of that. So that's a detail of a Botticelli painting, and it would represent classical art, even though classical is not the word that's usually used to describe 15th century Italian painting. But in Wölfflin, classical art, so-called, is linear, and you can see, obviously, Botticelli's painting is very drawn. There's a lot of drawing in it. It's very linear. Planar, it's very flat, like the sky. A lot of the skin is very flat. Closed forms as opposed to open ones. They all have outlines and so on. And just to take a Baroque example to contrast, that's Velázquez, so he would represent a Baroque painter. And so if you look at the right-hand bullet point lists, this is more painterly, clearly, much more invested in paint handling, showing the handling of paint. Recessional is much more to do with perspective and space, and it's open, like the right-hand side of that profile fades into darkness and so on. So basically, Wölfflin only had a single principle, linear versus painterly. He did expand it into 5 properties, but he experienced all art as an oscillation between linear and painterly. His entire system is kind of confused, as you can tell, because he's got this classical and Baroque sort of, master pair for his pendulum swings of art, and then he's got these lists of 5, actually there are more qualities. But in the list, he really likes linear and painterly, so linear and painterly is a little like classical and Baroque. It's a little bit confused. There's a wonderful essay on this, if you're interested, which I have there on the left. The classic is the Baroque, and essentially that's a postmodern deconstruction of Wölfflin, showing that really he only had one idea in his head, and that was this idea of classic art, which was linear, and all the things that happen to it as soon as you make classic art, you go and you make Baroque art. So oscillating history would go more or less like this. Here are the standard periods of art, as in the last lecture. standard periods of Western art, starting with classical, medieval, Renaissance, and Baroque, and a couple that Verflint didn't talk about, modern and postmodern. So now, if you think about that from Verflint's point of view, how to think of that as oscillating history, classical Greek art would be classical, but medieval art wouldn't be a new name medieval. It would actually be a Baroque phase, because it would be an elaboration of classical art. Then the Renaissance would be a return to classical art, because Renaissance artists actually did look to classical ancient Rome and Greece for their models. So there's historical truth in that. And then the period that's always known as the Baroque would be a Baroque period after that. And you could continue that too. Modern would be a classical period, although Verflint didn't say that. And Baroque would definitely be a property of postmodern art. So my second example is the German art historian Panofsky. He wrote a book on Albrecht Dürer, and he says in that book that Dürer was influenced by both northern, that is German, and southern, that is Italian, modes of art making. So this is north and south of the Alps. This German, Dürer was visited Germany twice, crossed the Alps twice, and he wrote about the differences between his own quote-unquote northern art and Italian art, and that's what is the subject of Panofsky's book. So that's not supposed to say picture on left. That's Panofsky. So he proposes that Dürer was undecided between Germanic and Italianate qualities of art, and there's a lot of truth to that. It does seem that way from what Dürer actually wrote. Panofsky says that he oscillated between the two. And he says that the choice between being a quote-unquote purely German artist and a follower of Italian art styles was a quote innate conflict in Dürer's mind. It's also possible to read Panofsky's own book this way, because as a German art historian, he also felt similar choices between Italian and German cultural influences. So his own book is also an example of this kind of oscillating history. So I'll show you on a table some of the pairs of what Panofsky calls topics. So these are a little bit like the list of 5 properties in Verflint's books, but they're different terms in this book by Panofsky on Albrecht Dürer. So in this case, it's not classical and Baroque, but it's Southern and Northern, or Italian and German. And so here are some of the things that Panofsky says, that Southern Italian art is reasoned, it's rational. Northern art is intuitive, depends on intuition. That Southern art that's done in Italy has a unity in its compositions, and German art is additive, meaning that the German artists in Dürer's view would say, look at their pictures really close up and add a little bit here and a little bit there, never step back to see the whole coherence or balance or unity of the entire composition. And just to read one more row of this table, Italian art was associated in Dürer's mind with theory. He had his own 16th century German word for that, but the idea was that, that Italian art was ruled by theory, had art theories, and German art, Dürer thought, was, quote, powerful but unsound. That's Panofsky's description of Dürer's idea of the art of his own country, was working without art theory. So I'll show you how this works in Panofsky's book. He says that you could see this duality all through Albrecht Dürer's art. This is a print called Young Couple Threatened by Death. The composition as a whole is unified and proportionate. The figures are pretty much centered in the composition and so on, and that would be a Southern trait. On the right, the death that's watching over this young couple. It's a moralizing print. He's holding an hourglass on his head. That's a kind of disproportionate, grotesque figure, and that would be, therefore, in Northern forms, disproportionate, whereas the overall composition is inspired by, or is in general, an example of Italian balance and harmony and so on. To take one more detail of this, on the left there's a landscape with trees receding into the distance. In the front, there's a plant in a kind of unnatural close-up. That would be a Northern thing. And Albrecht Dürer himself did pictures just of clumps of grass and things like that. He was very interested in extreme close-ups of things, idiosyncratic details. And of leaves and bugs and things in other pictures. So this landscape starts in a strange way with something that's a little too close, like a close-up of some grass, even though it's behind the person's hand. So that's the beginning of it. That's a northern trait. In the middle distance, there are a couple of groves of trees receding, and they're more southern because they become more geometric and orderly as you go to the back. And in the background, in the far background, they become kind of like cup shapes. And that's a very Italianate thing to do because it's geometric. It's a geometric abbreviation for the idea of forest. So there you could see in the landscape going from the foreground full of northern traits to the background full of southern traits. And to give one more example, this is called Nemesis. It's a large engraving. It's the most detailed of all of Dürer's engravings. And again, you could see that the whole composition as a whole, if you look at it from a distance, from far enough back, it's very balanced. The figure of Nemesis on her sphere in the heavens is centered in the picture. And I'm going to show a close-up of this part right here in a minute. But first, I wanted to show the drapery. Also shows this conflict, innate conflict in Dürer's mind, because the drapery itself is symmetrical enough, but if you look at it closely, it's got lots of little wrinkles in it, and that would be very northern to get carried away by details like that. Same kind of things with the wings of Nemesis. The largest feathers in them are nicely done, very sort of architecturally looking. But look how small the feathers get, what I think are called covert feathers. If you look up toward the tops of the wings, they get really, really tiny, almost microscopic. And that would be a northern trait, kind of myopic and disproportionate and kind of endless in its detail. So here's the lower left, the landscape, the lower left of Nemesis. And just to show a few different things in this landscape. There's a house down there that has a kind of crazy amount of detail. It's got 2 dormer windows, maybe 3 what are called medieval slit windows. It's got a projecting staircase halfway across the facade there with 3 lights, as they call windows in architectural history. 4 or 5 windows on the right. There's a kitchen, the addition. It's almost microscopic, but he's actually figured out everything that he wants to have in it. There's somebody walking across toward the town, toward the bridge, carrying a staff, but it's really hard to make out what in the world that figure is because it's just almost too small for Dürer himself to draw. And over on the left, there's a roadside shrine of some sort. There's a cross, and maybe it's a ruined gravestone. Also really hard to tell. So those are tiny, quote-unquote, northern or Germanic traits within a landscape, which as a whole is very well balanced. So there are problems with this idea of oscillating history. As Werflin can be very persuasive, and if you're ever assigned his book in a class, you'll see that his descriptions can be really pretty amazing of artworks. But it's important to realize that his theories aren't true for all different cultures of art, and largely because he's, like every historian, a product of his own particular time and place. He was influenced by German idealist philosophy at the beginning of the 20th century, so it's not a kind of neutral, timeless, objective way of looking. It's a kind of looking that was made possible by the fact that he didn't pay attention to politics or society or the artists or anything like that. And it's also helpful to bear in mind that he didn't really control his own theory. That deconstruction article I showed by this guy Marshall Brown is a good example of that. He couldn't really account for elements of his own theory. It didn't really have a structure that was stable. He couldn't really describe what might happen after an oscillation, why the oscillation happened to begin with, and so on. So it's more a descriptive theory than it is a predictive theory. The same kind of thing could be said about Panofsky in that book on Dürer, because there's no outside perspective in that book. There's no way to stand back from Panofsky's own problem of choosing north and south, because he himself, as a European art historian, was an inheritor of that exact problem that he was studying. But still, oscillating history can be really attractive theory, because it can seem just plain natural and correct, even when you apply it to cultures that are really far from the ones that either of these two people studied. So here's an example. You could look at a Chinese ceramic like this, and if you don't know anything about Chinese ceramics, you could ask yourself, is this Baroque or classical? In quotation marks, of course. Without a point of comparison, you might not have much to choose between. You could say that it was either one. But if you put it next to another one, this is another Chinese vessel, then it can seem immediately obvious that the one on the right is geometric, it's linear, it's quote-unquote classic, and the one on the left is Baroque, it's much more spatial and dynamic and all the rest of that, conforms to Verflin's categories, and I suppose maybe even to Panofsky's and Dürer's categories. It can seem just kind of intuitively, naturally obvious that art has these two possibilities, then it can move back and forth between them. Or to take a contemporary art example, this is a sculpture by Tim Hawkinson, and it could look Baroque by itself, but if you put it next to something that's very geometric, like I have a Dan Ramirez piece here, if you put those two together, then again it can seem just irresistibly true that the one of them is classic, the other's Baroque. The one is linear, the other one is not, and so on. So these categories can be really difficult to avoid. I think the best strategy is just to remain alert to them, whenever it appears to you that something is oscillating, or that something is part of a pole and that it might go to its opposite pole. Whenever that seems plausible, you can always ask yourself, where did you get that idea? Did you read it in the textbook, or did it just sort of appear to you? Not that it's more reliable to read it in a textbook, but where did the idea come from? Because it's not the objects themselves that are speaking; it's ideas that we're thinking of in relation to them. And also, you can ask yourself where you got the words that you might be using to describe the difference, like linear and things like that, because these words also have histories. And then, I suppose in the end also, just what makes it seem true? Why should it be that art should oscillate like this? Does that actually make sense as a model for art? So it's not that this is wrong. It should be cause for suspicion that it seems to fit all art. And it may very well be something that's not soluble because it is such a general idea, but it's always good to be aware of it and to be skeptical of it when you see it.